Welcome to another Telltale Books podcast. I'm Greg, and I'm continuing my H.G. Wells series with the first iteration of the Time Machine to be called the Time Machine. Now, this is H.G. Wells' 20th published work in my bibliography of H.G. Wells, which may or may not be accurate. And after he had tried to do the Chronic Argonauts, and that kind of failed in the middle, he only published the first few sections of it and then stopped and didn't complete it. I'm reading that he wrote a draft for the rest of the Chronic Argonauts that sounds a lot like the final novel of the Time Machine, going into the future and having, finding human beings in a dystopian type future. And he used the characters from the Chronic Argonauts, the Traveler and the Priest, and carried them over. But he never published that for, I don't know why. And then he went and started writing a second draft, and this is only known because he was telling a friend of his about it, and the friend wrote this down in some kind of memoir or something. And he was telling this friend about this new version called the Time Machine, which again is similar plot but still not the final story, based on what this friend relates of what Wells told him about it. Okay, so those two drafts are lost. Nobody has been able to find them, so there's nowhere you can read either of those. They were never published in the magazines. And then 1894, Wells writes the Time Machine again in a series of small chapters, short chapters, that were published in the National Observer magazine from March to June of 1894. Now, once again, this serialization of the Time Machine was not finished because the editor that had been buying this from Wells left the magazine. So after the June issue, this editor wasn't there. The National Observer did not continue publishing these stories. They dropped it. There is a chapter that seems to finish the story that was never published, and it actually has it's handwritten and has changes on it. And that version of the National Observer Time Machine can be found in this book, the W.W. Norton critical edition of the Time Machine, which was published in 2009. You can still buy this off of websites. I think I got this on Amazon, but it's still available. You can also find the published versions of the National Observer Time Machine in this book by McFarlane, The Time Machine and Invention, which is a critical text of the 1895 London First Edition with an introduction and appendices in the appendices of the Chronic Argonauts and the National Observer version. And another book you can find this version of the Time Machine is the Definitive Time Machine, published by Indiana University Press. Now these two you're going to have to get used. These are not available new anymore. These two have the published National Observer chapters. This one has the published National Observer chapters plus the unpublished, what seems to be the final chapter of that version. Now, the National Observer version of the Time Machine is pretty short. It's definitely not a novel. It's really barely a novelette. It's almost short enough to qualify as just a short story. It's pretty short. And there are some significant differences. In this version of the Time Machine, the time traveler only travels to 12,203 AD, where in the final version it's was it 804 703 AD or something like that. Okay, so this is the original time machine called the Time Machine, and in this you have the time traveler. He invents the time machine. This one, the whole story is him relating his experiences to his friends, which I believe the final novel does the same thing. But in this one, the whole story is very much a conversation between him and his friends, and so there's a lot of what we would call today mansplaining. There's a lot of technical explanations, technical dialogues about time and dimensions and the machine, and then he tells of what he found, and he does relate the story of landing and finding the Eloi and the Morlocks and the giant Sphinx sculpture. That's all in this story, but it's all done much more compactly, much more shorter story, so a lot less detail, a lot less plot, a lot less action. Weena is not in it. There's a lot of differences, but the basic story that we know and love of the Time Machine is all here. The other thing to know about this story, about this version of the Time Machine, is that the writing feels like he's still finding his way. At this time, H.G. Wells had not written a novel. He had written some short stories. Some of them were good, but this attempt at the Time Machine felt kind of amateurish. The writing style was not as good as the novel we all know and love. Okay, so as far as enjoying the Time Machine, this one's a little hard to enjoy because it's a little too short, a little too simple, a little too amateurish yet. But the cool thing here is you can see Wells feeling his way to what would become the final version of the Time Machine. And now, this whole story, starting with the Chronic Argonauts, going to this version, there are 3 more versions to come. Two more versions, and then we land on the version that we're more familiar with. And then there was another revision in 1924. Wells did a lot of revisions to this book, trying to make it perfect over the years. He tended to do this a lot with his writing. That's something I didn't realize before I started doing this deep dive into Wells, is how much he revised his work. He wrote a lot of short stories, a lot of science fiction short stories, especially in the 1890s. And when he published a collection of his, it was kind of like the best short stories of H.G. Wells. It was The Country of the Blind and Other Stories, published in, I think, 1906, if I remember correctly. He revised all the stories for that publication. So they're all different from the original magazine appearances. And he said in that collection that these were his definitive versions. But of course he went and revised Country of the Blind again in the 1920s. So he was constantly revising, rewriting all of his work. When the Sleeper Wakes is another good example of that. He wrote that novel, published it in a magazine in 1899, rewrote it, dropping some chapters, changing a lot for the book publication in 1899. So the magazine serial of When the Sleeper Wakes is way different from the first book publication of When the Sleeper Wakes. And then, I forget what year it was, 1912 or something like that, he completely rewrote the novel and retitled it The Sleeper Awakes. So there's 3 versions of that story, each of them quite a bit different from the other. He did this a lot. This was common practice for Wells. He was always trying to perfect his own work and apparently never getting there. And The Time Machine is the worst one, probably because it was really his first outing with fiction was the Chronic Argonauts. And it was never finished, so of course that wouldn't have been satisfactory for him. And so he rewrote it as The Time Machine for National Observer, but anybody can see it's not a mature work. It's not mature writing yet. So he was to revise it again for publication in another magazine before it would be revised yet again for publication in a book. So March of 1894 was the first true appearance of The Time Machine in a novelette version in National Observer. As much as I really, really, really love the story of The Time Machine, this version, it's too much like a rough draft. It really is too much like a rough draft. And so I can't give this a top tail. I don't think I could really recommend it, except to the people like me that have to dig in and see all this stuff. If you just want to enjoy The Time Machine, get a publication of The Time Machine and enjoy it and forget about all these other versions of it. But if you have a deep fascination for Wells and just need to know all about this book, then you really want to read this National Observer version of The Time Machine, because it is fascinating to see him starting to put this story together towards what would become its final form. So, have you ever read the National Observer version of The Time Machine? If so, leave your comments in the comments section. Heck, if you just want to say anything about The Time Machine in general or H.G. Wells in general, go ahead and leave your comments. And hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, please. It really helps us. We have reached 1,000 viewers now. I'm very happy about that. As I shoot this, it was just yesterday, February 17th, that we hit 1,000 subscribers. It's been 5 years of struggling. The first 3 years, less than 400 subscribers. You know, struggling to get those numbers up there, struggling to reach more people with this, and we're finally at 1,000. It's slow going. I knew this was going to be slow. I didn't think it was going to be this slow, but we're getting there. We're moving forward towards our ultimate goals here. And for the short term, my ultimate goal is the next H.G. Wells is going to be this one's going to be another nonfiction article that he published titled The Flat Earth Again. I hope you'll come back, join me for that and all the other H.G. Wells. We've got a major H.G. Wells short story right after The Flat Earth Again, The Stolen Bacillus. Come back and join me for all the H.G. Wells and everything else we do here on Telltale Books.